Of course, most of the food that's on our table, most of the vegetables anyway, comes in from California, it seems like, and most of that food is planted and cultivated and taken care of and harvested and packed and sent along here from the farm workers who work out there. They've worked in terrible conditions, but the conditions were even worse before Cesar Chavez came around and helped to organize the United Farm Workers. Out from Arizona in 1937, and he had lived on land that they owned. And they weren't rich by any means, but they had land and they had a big old thick-walled adobe home that the family shared, and he had 200 cousins lived around there, and they had a little store and got by until the drought came in the 30s that drove the folks out of Oklahoma, and it drove them out of there, and they packed it all up and they headed out to California. And it was just a rude awakening after leaving their own farm there and coming into this little one-room shack where they were to stay, which had no doors, and there were 12 of them. And they had to share a bunch of bathrooms, and going out and finding out that, of course, there was no place to do your business out in the fields. And everybody shared the same dipper, so they passed around the same germs, and you did your hoeing with a short-handled hoe, bent over all day long, so that before the age of 30, your back was wrecked. And just all kinds of stuff like that. And people had tried for quite a few years to organize the fields, but found it just impossible because people were moving around all the time. There was just too much riding against you. And he just made up his mind that he was going to do it. He got to Lorre Wyatt to help him, and in 1962, they formed the United Farm Workers. And one of the things they did when they were trying to garner attention was they had a 300-mile pilgrimage, is what he called it, a march up to Sacramento to draw attention to all the terrible conditions of everybody. And of course, as with Gandhi and as with the civil rights movement, the press came. And they started out with just a handful of people and only one person in the first town would keep them, but as they went and they went and they went, they picked up more and more people, and they started appearing on the television in the state and around the country. When they got to Sacramento, they had 10,000 people and a mariachi band to play for them. They got their first contract. Well, one of the things that they thought about a little bit later on was the use of pesticides. And you probably may have noticed that that's still a problem. Well, Tish Hinojosa, who lives pretty close to the border and is a fine singer-songwriter, has this little song that she sang called Something in the Rain. And it's about a little boy, maybe 12 years old, whose sister is dying from the pesticide poisoning. And he's trying to figure it all out, and in the beginning of the song, he's kind of believing the line that had been given him, that it's something in the rain. And then he starts to think about it. And it kind of sounds like maybe he came into contact with some folks who were organizing, because he starts to change his thinking. It goes like this. Mom and Dad have worked these fields, I don't know how many years. I'm just a boy, but I know how. Go to school, work is slow. We have seen our country's roads, from Bakersfield to Illinois. And when trouble comes our way, oh yeah, I've seen my daddy pray. There's something wrong with little sister, I hear her crying by my side. shaking as she holds her. We try to hold her through the night. And Mom says, close your eyes, baby, told. Dream someplace far from here, like the pictures in your school books. Someday you can take us there. There must be something in the rain. I'm not sure just what that means. I believe to talk so sins of men and prophets break the land. There must be something in the rain. Oh, what else can cause this pain? Those airplanes clear the crops so things can grow. Oh no, there must be something in the rain. Well, Somos el barco means we are the boat, and the words to the chorus are Somos el barco, try that, Somos el barco, Somos el mar, Somos el mar, we are the sea. Yo navego en ti, yo navego en ti, I sail in you, tú navegas en mí, you sail in me. And we sing it in Spanish and then in English. Here's the chorus. Somos el barco, somos el mar, somos el mar, yo navego en ti, yo navego en ti, tú navegas en mí, tú navegas en mí. We are the boat, we are the boat, we are the sea, we are the sea. I sail in you, I sail in you, you sail in me, you sail in me. That we are sailing on is built by many hands. The sea that we are sailing on is touching many lands. Somos el barco, somos el mar, somos el mar. Yo navego en ti, yo navego en ti, tú navegas en mí. We are the boat, we are the boat, we are the sea. I sail in you, you sail in me. Sing once more that song line. Somos el barco, somos el mar. Yo navego en ti, tú navegas en mí. We are the boat, we are the sea. I sail in you, you sail in me.
If we could consider each other a neighbor, a sister, or brother, it could be a wonderful, wonderful world. It could be a wonderful world. Oh yes, it could be a wonderful world.
If each little kid could have fresh milk each day, if all working folks had enough time to play, if each homeless town had a good place to stay,
consider each other a neighbor, a sister, or brother, it could be a wonderful, wonderful world. It could be a wonderful world. Oh yes, it could be a wonderful world.
Now the Indian Territory is basically where Oklahoma is now and the surrounding states. And it was called the Indian Territory because the government was constantly moving Indian tribes there because the land was the least desirable they could find. And they wanted to take all the good land that the Indians were on. So they moved the Creek and the Cree and the Chickasaw and the Cherokee and the Seminole Indians, all peaceful tribes from the southeast who had turned to farming and the white man's way of life. They moved them, all the ones they could get a hold of, on the Trail of Tears out to Oklahoma, and they moved other Native Americans there. There were some blacks who fled slavery and went there. And there were some whites, but the whites who were there were almost all criminals. They were the worst outlaws in the country because there was no law enforcement there. And so they had hideouts throughout the territory. Well, into that rode 17-year-old Bass Reeves. One day, Bass was riding his horse, and out of the brush, hell-bent for leather, came another horse with a little girl on its back. She was maybe 4, 5, 6 years old. She was holding on for dear life, and behind them were running 3 wolves. Well, the girl lost her grip and fell down among the wolves, which immediately jumped on her and began biting her. Bass turned his horse and kicked it as hard as he could and shot for that place. He got there, he jumped off the horse into the middle of the wolves and started kicking them as hard as he could. One of the wolves jumped up and bit into his thigh and tore down his thigh 6 inches from top to bottom. He pulled out his gun, he shot 2 of the wolves, and the third one ran off. And quickly and gently as he could, he picked up that little girl, he got in the saddle. He figured that she had come from a settlement 3 miles away. He looked at his thigh and the blood was coming out very fast and he wasn't sure if he could make it. But he rode as fast as he could and the girl was bleeding as well and he wanted to get her to help. After about a mile he got dizzy. After 2 miles he was faint. And after that he just heard some voices and he felt the horse stop and he went out. He woke up, he didn't know how much later, a few days maybe, in a sod hut that belonged to the family of the little girl. They were Creek Indians, and they'd been lovingly taking care of Bass ever since they found him and the little girl on top of the horse. One day, Peter came in. Peter was the big brother of the little girl whose name was Betty, and he said, "You saved Betty's life. Hurt yourself." He spoke a little bit of English. And Bass said, "You don't know anything to me. If you hadn't helped me, I wouldn't be alive now." He said, "No, not oh. You saved Betty's life. Betty, sister. You, me, brothers." Put his hands together like this, he said, "All together, one family." Well, Bass spent 22 years with the Creek Indians there in the Indian Territory, getting to know many languages and just about everything they knew about their way of survival and their way of life. In 1863, emancipation was declared, and he left the Indian Territory. He went to Arkansas, he bought a ranch, and he became a very successful rancher. And he had 10 children with a wife named Nellie. He became a real, true family man. When she died, he married another woman named Winnie. If that was all to his life, he would have led a full, exciting, and successful life. But really, his legend didn't begin till he was 51 years old. When he was 51 years old, in 1875, a new judge came to the Indian Territory. The government had decided it was time to clean up the situation there and restore some order. And they sent Judge Isaac Parker. He was known as the hanging judge. And his first job, which was huge, was to hire 200 federal marshals. And Bass was one of them. For 22 years, almost a quarter century, he had been loved and cared for and trusted by the Creek Indians there in the Indian Territory. And being the kind of person he was, it'd be just natural that he would be willing to sacrifice to help them have a safer life. And so he became a marshal. Now, he was extremely successful. He brought in his 32 years, more than 3,000 outlaws, often more than one or two at a time. And the amazing thing about it is that he only killed 14 of the worst, most dangerous outlaws in the country in bringing them in. And because he hated violence, so he would do anything he could to avoid killing somebody. One of the things that he did a lot was he would put on disguises. He had all kinds of disguises. The idea was to get up close to him before they knew who he was. He dressed as an old farmer. He got an old cart pulled by some oxen, old run-down cart, and as he got near the hideout of these guys, he intentionally ran it into a ditch and got the wheel stuck. Well, he figured the outlaws would come out because they didn't want him drawing attention, and sure enough, they did. They helped him get it out, and while they were pulling up a wheel, he pulled out his gun and said, "Let's go nice and peacefully now." Well, they suddenly realized who he was, and they dropped their guns. Nobody wanted to mess with Bass Reeves. In fact, several people, quite a few people, turned themselves in as soon as they heard that Bass Reeves had their warrant. Sometimes it wasn't so easy. Another time, he dressed as an old lady. He had a full-length old gingham dress. He had a bonnet on. One of them looked at him and said, "Let me see you prove that you're a woman." Oops. Well, wasn't much else to do but draw his gun and say, "You're under arrest. Let's go nice and peaceful." But there were so many of them, they figured, we got them outnumbered. They drew their guns and started firing. They fired several holes through his dress. They fired a hole through his bonnet. They knocked off his belt, and they knocked a heel off of his shoe. One of the many, many, many times he was fired at but never hit in all his days. But he managed to kill 2 of them and wound 2 more before he brought them in. He brought in 12 guys. Judge Parker, he laughed. He said, "He's my bargain basement marshal. He brings them in cheaper by the dozen." Well, the hardest job he had to do, though, was bringing in his own son, Benjamin. Benjamin, in a fit of anger, had shot dead his wife because she was unfaithful. None of the marshals wanted to bring Benjamin in. None of them. Especially because they were afraid that if I got in a gunfight, they might kill Bass's son. So Bass did what he'd always done. He did his duty. He went out and he found his son and he knocked on the door of his hideout. He said, "You got a cup of coffee for your old man?" The son answered the door. He said, "Well, I figured you'd be here before long." And they sat down and Bass said, "There's no way around it. You've got to go in and serve your sentence." They sentenced him to life in prison, but he got out in 10 years because he was a model prisoner and never got in trouble again. So when we talk about all these guys who make for nice stories, there's one guy who was the real deal. He was the real cowboy hero, and his name was Bass Reeves.